I'm Irene, alcoholic. I know she's not here, but I want to thank Lisa for the invitation. It's always an honor and privilege to speak at a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm so happy to see Alice here. She's a, it's been very special because when I moved out here, I retired and I thought, oh, everything's going to be blissful. Well, issues, and now she gets to sometimes very, fun, but it's been a pleasure to have those rides with her. Um, and I want to welcome the people who are new, a lot of times we read how it works a little bit more extended, and there's a part of it that says our adventures before and after. And I know you've had adventures before, that's why you're here, but you're also going to have adventures in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I don't know what they are, but I can tell you from my experience, from my own life and seeing others, they are amazing. You're going to be like, wow, I can't believe that is really happening. And I can't wait for you to see that. I'm going to get some stats out of the way. My sobriety date is September 30th, 1989. And I'm so grateful to have a sobriety date because for many, many years I could not keep one. I first started coming to Alcoholics Anonymous when I was 18 years old, and I finally got sober when I was 28. And I still do things that you're supposed to do. Like I love the fact that I got to greet with RJ and with Kyle, because that's one of my regular commitments at my home group in Rockridge is I was a greeter for a year, and I love that. And I love having those regular commitments and doing things that are, like, oh yeah, going beyond, what I'm supposed to do. I need to do that because I actually have an acquaintance or friend who had 30 years and now she's drinking again. And for her, she thinks it's normal, and I've been to meetings with her. It's not normal. So I'm so grateful, that I'm still doing what I'm supposed to do. The other thing is that I have a sponsor, and I still check in with her regularly every week on Thursday at 3 p.m. That's my call-in time. And, I've adored her even before she was my sponsor. She's in Los Angeles, and her name is Sharon. When I was new, maybe about like 2 months sober or so, my first sponsor would give me cassette tapes. This was back in the 80s. And she would give me tapes of her favorite speakers, like Norm A, or Sandy B, or Sharon B at the time. And for me, the best speakers were the ones who were able to like calm me down, because at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, I could not sleep. So for me, the best speakers were like almost like lullabies, and I would hear their stories and the laughter, and they would put me to sleep. So, the first time I ever met Sharon, she was speaking at a meeting in Los Angeles, and the custom is to greet the person, greet the speaker afterwards. And I'm in line, and I'm thinking, God, there's my hero. What am I going to say to her? And I was feeling awkward and, of course, self-centered and self-obsessed. And I went up to her and I said, I love your tapes. They put me to sleep, And she looked at me, and my sponsor at the time, her name was June, had to act like an interpreter and say, no, that's actually a compliment, And the other thing that's helped me a lot is to have a home group. I moved from Los Angeles, and I had a really strong home group in Los Angeles. And I moved over here. And, meetings are different in the Bay Area. I had to get used to that, but I knew I couldn't do what I've done before in sobriety. And I'll share a little bit about that as well, where I don't go to meetings because I'm like, oh, it's not the same, it's different. I really had to throw myself in and be a part of Bay Area Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm really grateful for that. Share what it was like, what happened, what it's like now. I grew up in a poor Mexican family in West Los Angeles. And, it wasn't so much being poor was a problem. The problem was that we lived about like 2 miles away from Beverly Hills. And so, this area that I grew up on, you were either Mexican American or Japanese American, and you serviced all the fancy homes. And at the time, everyone went to public schools. The public schools were great. And so I went to school with kids who went, to Paris, or they skied the Alps. And, I was going to tell them, oh, yeah, I spent my summer playing in the alley, because that was not cool. And I was different as a kid. I had buck teeth. I spoke with a lisp. I walked pigeon-toed. I was bullied as a kid. But the thing that was, really had a dramatic impact on my life was that my second grade teacher told my mom that she thought I might be, quote, mentally retarded. Now it's called intellectually disabled. I don't think that's the case because eventually I graduated from Harvard Law School. But, and I remember the first time I was walking on the campus at Harvard, I remember thinking to myself, God, I'm wondering if I'm one of the first mentally retarded people to. I am obsessed with feeling different, and even in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, if I'm not, following the spiritual kit that's laid at my feet, I will still feel different. And so I really have to watch out for that. But I was different because in the late 70s, everyone was drinking and drugging, it seemed like in my high school. And I wasn't. I was a nerd. I was a geek. I was afraid of people who drank. They were the cool kids hanging out at the bleachers. And, later on, when people would confront me about my drinking, I felt like telling them, like, you don't understand. I have nerd and geek insurance against becoming an alcoholic because only the cool kids become alcoholics, not me, So how it happened is I went to UC Berkeley and I still wasn't drinking. But one day, I remember it was April 27, 1979. And that's why it was it was such a dramatic and transformative event that I remember that date. And I was in the dorm and a couple of the women there said, hey, do you want to join us to go to this restaurant? It was called Fondue Fred's. And for some reason, I said yes. Now, I'm usually not a joiner, I remember when I first came to Alcoholics Anonymous and they used to have pamphlets. And there was a pamphlet called Loners and Alcoholics Anonymous. And I said, that's the group I want to join, I didn't know Loners and Alcoholics Anonymous was really geared for people who live in Antarctica and you can't get to meetings, But I went, and I remember before I went to this party, I remember walking there and thinking, God, who am I going to sit next to? What am I going to talk about? What are they going to be thinking about me? Because I'm always so obsessed about what you think about me. And I sat down and they started serving wine and the magic of alcohol happened immediately. And I was just like, wow, this is great. I was able to talk to people. It was sort of like, remember that game show? No, maybe a lot of you are too young to remember this. There used to be a game show called Price is Right. And they would call your name and the person would run down and they were so excited to join. That's what it felt like when I drank. It felt like the doors, these glass doors suddenly opened and I can be part of you. Because I always wanted to join you. I just didn't know how to do that. And I remember this woman next to me said, are you all right? And I wanted to tell her, oh my God, I've been wanting this feeling all my life because for many, many years, I was always suicidal, depressed. I grew up very strict Catholic and I was told you can't kill yourself. But I was 18 years old and I thought there's no way I'm going to make it until I'm 20. There's no way feeling how I feel about myself, I can't make it to 20. But alcohol for me, I really believe saved my life because it gave me a path to figure out, oh, I can survive life as long as I have my whiskey, as long as I have my bottles, I'm going to be okay, Later on, I would, sing, the U2 song that with or without you, I can't live. I would sing that to my bottles of alcohol because that's how I felt, There's even in that song, there's wailing. I mean, that's how I felt about, when people would say, you can't drink. And for me, they immediately said, I can't drink. During the first month of my drinking, the people in my dorm came up to me and said, Irene, you have a problem with alcohol. And I just thought it was so unfair because I didn't even really get to enjoy that, that luxury of really drinking and just really partying without people being on my case. But they knew I had a problem. I think one of the signs was the fact that, the police would escort me home, or they would find me passed out on Telegraph Avenue, and I've driven by Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley and, 18-year-old girl laying, on the sidewalk. I'm like, I was so really protected by my higher power that nothing ever happened, But one of those fortunate events was my next door neighbor came up to me and she said, I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've been sober for 9 months and you drink like I used to drink. And I knew she was hinting at something, but I didn't want to hear it because, like I just told you, I thought alcohol was going to help me survive life. And I was not someone that was like a party person. Although I must say that first day after, the day after I drank and got totally drunk and they had to, carry me home, the next day people were saying, "Oh my God, Irene, you were so funny and charming." And I remember thinking to myself, God, I wish I had been there to have seen that, But I was in a total blackout. And believe me, that was the last time anyone ever said I was funny and charming when I was drinking. Because I am a falling down drunk. I'm the one that I would be passed out in the bar, in the bathroom. And I remember a woman walking over me and I said, "Don't mind me, I'm just resting." And I was also a violent drunk. I was a total Jekyll and Hyde, like the book talks about. I really don't bear any resemblance to how I am sober. And it's just, when people would confront me about my drinking later on, I felt like, there was an old movie called Sybil, and she had like all these multiple personalities. And people would, confront me about my drinking. I felt like saying, "You're talking to the wrong person. You should be talking to the Irene who's drunk, not me. I don't have no knowledge of what you're talking about," because I was such a blackout drinker. My drinking just continued to get worse and worse. I went off to law school. Actually, before I went to law school, I actually started going to meetings on a regular basis my senior year of college because the university ordered me to go to AA. And, my first sponsor, her name was Melanie, and her husband was Julian. Even though they've passed, I go to meetings in the East Bay, El Cerrito, Berkeley area, and people still remember that. And I went to a meeting about a week or two ago, and we talked about the legacy that our old timers, have for us. And I just thought about them, and Melanie would pick me up at the dorm, and she would take me to the meeting. And it was like, for me, it was just pure love. I didn't know anything about steps. I didn't know anything. I just knew people were welcoming me. And I think they just, each person seemed like they would cry when they would hear about my, drunks, my slips. And for me, my slips or relapses were not like slips. They're more like falls off the Grand Canyon, I remember I had just graduated from college. And I was maybe about 2 months sober. And I thought, I always get myself in trouble when I go out. I'm just going to stay in my room. Nothing bad will happen. And what happened is I locked myself out of my room where all the bottles were. And I was hysterical. This is according to the people who were at the dorm, because I have no knowledge of what happened. And I locked myself out of my room. And I came out of a blackout. And these two Berkeley cops are shoving me against the wall and hitting me. And my next door neighbors pleading with the cops saying, "Please don't hurt her, please don't hurt her." And, the cops were actually acting in self-defense, because when they came, I was hysterical because my bottles were inside my room, and I started hitting them. So, they weren't really at fault. And I remember the young cop opened the door and he saw all the bottles and he said, "Oh, sweetie, why do you want to do this to yourself?" And I said, "Because I hate myself so much." Those are the feelings I had. And I went off to law school. I had another horrible drunk there. I remember going with my wife back to the Harvard campus, and I was showing her, "Oh, see, that's the hospital I went to." Like most people are not showing, when you go back on a school campus, you're not saying, "Oh, that's where I ended up." But what happened is I was really upset about a grade I received. And I went out, and it was February, it was snowing. I fell, all the snow drifts. And I'm from LA. I don't know anything about, how to maneuver drunk in snow. And I came back to the dorm. And again, this is what people told me, that I was in a blackout. And they were trying to take the whiskey bottle from my hand, and I started to hit them. And my friend said, "Irene, you're ugly drunk and you hit hard," and it would just pain me to hear that. But eventually I did get sober, and I was sober for about 4.5 years. I went to Los Angeles. I got, a great job, and I loved that job. I was a public defender in LA. And I got to represent a lot of people like you, and it was wonderful. I really got to be a love and service, really. But what happened is that little by little, I stopped doing what I'm supposed to do, and I failed to enlarge my spiritual life. I think that's what really happened. And I stopped going to meetings. I know the day I drank again after 4.5 years, I know I was not helping another alcoholic. I know that day I was not asking God to please keep me sober that day. I was not doing what you're supposed to do. And at work, they had beer and pizza. And my head went to, oh, it's beer. It seems so innocent. Well, it's not. And I saw myself go for that beer. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going to get drunk here at work. I will get drunk at home if I want to do that, but I won't get drunk here. But once it's in my system, it's like all bets are off. And that's what happened. I got drunk at work. And I still have the message board from people from work talking about my behavior at work when I was getting drunk, because I was doing like field sobriety tests in the hallway, and that I was so surprised that I was touching my nose and that there was a nose there. I mean, it was just horrible. And my friends are hiding me from the bosses because when I'm sober, I'm a good employee, and my bosses are looking for me to, congratulate me for a good, job done. And my friends had to hide me. And I remember, a friend of mine had to take me home. And actually before then, one of my supervisors called a friend who I actually had told that I was in Alcoholics Anonymous because she would see that I wasn't drinking on Friday nights. And my supervisor called my friend and said, there's something wrong with Irene. She's drunk. And my friend said, she can't be. She's in Alcoholics Anonymous. And my supervisor said, well, not now, because she's drunk, And it was hard. I was out for about a year and I could not get sober. I was the newcomer. I don't know if you have any. I know I have some in my meetings who raise their hand every week saying, I'm new. That was me. And I could not get this. And I just hope I never forget my last drunk. What happened is that I was drinking and I thought, I'm just going to go visit some friends because some reason I love to drink and drive. And, I'm so grateful that I didn't kill anyone that last night because I've actually been in court representing drunk drivers, my clients, and my client is sitting next to me and their family members are talking to my client and saying, you knew you had a problem with alcohol, yet you went out and you killed my brother, you killed my husband, you killed my little sister. And they could be talking about me, And so what happened, I was driving on the freeways, 405, which is a really big freeway there. And my friends were actually, later on, they were secretly hoping that I would have a, minor accident to wake me up. But what happened is that I was driving around and at one point I just wet my pants. And then later on, I thought, you know what, I should go look for a restroom. So I pulled into a gas station and right there, I asked the gas attendant, can I use the restroom? And he said, no. So right then I pulled down my pants, peed right there at the gas station, at the gas pump. And, that pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization, you don't have to define it for me, And later on, I ended up at my friend's house and I was knocking on the bottom of the door. And thankfully, I couldn't even lift my head to look at their faces of disgust and bewilderment. And all I heard them say was, Irene, crawl some more. And I crawled like combat style on my stomach to get into their apartment. And, around like 3:00 in the morning, I thought, I got to get out of here because I don't want to have that confrontation. I don't want that discussion of what's wrong with you because I don't know what's wrong with me, Why can't I knew, in the past I could do this and I couldn't do it anymore. And I remember going home and I remember taking a shower, feeling so disgusted with myself and crying in the tub and thought, I can't do this. So my best solution, this was back in '89, we had these big books, they were called Yellow Pages, so like Google printed, and I looked under guns because I thought, I can't live like this. I can't go back to Alcoholics Anonymous because I actually have my journal from that day. And I wrote, I can't stop drinking, but I refuse to go back to Alcoholics Anonymous because my pride, my ego just wouldn't let me go back. So, but then when I was looking, under guns, I heard a voice and I really believe it was my higher power, my God, that just said, call someone in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that voice became stronger. And Norm A used to talk about seconds and inches. It was for that moment, little bit of willingness, I was able to call. And the next sentence in my journal said, I called Sandy, a friend of mine who was also in the program. And she took me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was Saturday at 3:00, and I wasn't expecting to see anyone there, And sure enough, there was someone from my work who I actually had 12-step. Now she had more time. I was a little pissed that she had more time than I did. But the thing about it is that she had brought our boss to that meeting. And our boss is not an alcoholic, but we're always sending clients, we're always referring clients to Alcoholics Anonymous, even though we're not associated with the courts, And she wanted to know more. And I thought, oh my God, if I raise my hand, they're going to know that I've been drinking. Well, later on, I found out from a friend of mine, a normie, who said, God, we always thought you were drinking in the morning just because, you just smelled like alcohol because it was coming out of my pores, And thankfully, I had that moment of willingness where I had enough of AA in me where, I knew about, job and no job, wife or no wife, as long as I put other things before my dependence upon a higher power, before I dependence upon my God, I'm not going to get sober. And so I was willing to raise my hand and say, I'm new, And I had to do things that have been hard sometimes, like, for example, greeting. I remember my sponsor had me greet at this really big meeting on Thursday night. And I was so afraid. I remember this guy came up to me and said, oh my God, you look so scared. And I said, I am, but I did it anyway. And it was like the best thing. So like doing the commitments, making, like my sponsor, told me I had to go to lots of meetings. Like, oh yeah, I've heard about 90 meetings in 90 days. He said, no. I've heard some of your story. I know you haven't told me the worst. And I'm like, how did she know I haven't told her the worst? I want you to go to a meeting every day for the first year. I was like, whoa, all right, I'll do it. And I want you to get a commitment at every meeting. And that's what I did. I got little jobs at every meeting I went to, But what really changed for me was doing the steps, as outlined in the book. And I really am a believer in the big book. Although, my home group is the Sunday morning meeting. It's a 12 and 12. And I've now gotten more into, the 12 and 12. But for a long time, I love the book because it really gives me that roadmap. And, just going through the steps. And for me, I always envy people who would say, that obsession to drink immediately lifted. Well, that was not my experience, And so I share about it because there might be one person here who has the same feeling that they still want to drink even though they're coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I just want to tell you, you could still be sober even if you still have that obsession. And I remember sharing at a meeting at a conference in San Diego about my friend Shauna, and I would call her from the liquor store. I was maybe about, 9 months sober. I would call her and I would say, you know what, I'm just calling you to let you know that you've been so kind and sweet to me, but I can't stay sober. I got to drink. And she would say, no, wait for me. I'll meet you at, for lunch. And she would meet me, outside the liquor store, and we'd go somewhere. Or I would call her again and she would say, let's just get down on our knees and just, pray that the obsession to drink be lifted. And, she's Jewish and that's not usually the custom to get down on our knees, but we just did it. And for little by my 2-year birthday cake, that obsession to drink had lifted. And I was like, wow, that was amazing, And I had to be willing to really throw myself into that first step. And then, when I did my second and third step, with my sponsor again, I wanted to do it where just taking the action and, even though I grew up Catholic, I'm not a practicing Catholic, but for me, it was just doing something that made me submissive and in the sense of getting down on our knees and doing the third step prayer made it real for me, And one of the things that really helped me is my sponsor saying, you really have to change your concept of a higher power. Because I thought God was like out to get me, was, wanted to make life as horrible as possible for me, and I better, escape from this higher power. And I really had to change that. And really now, I really believe that my higher power loves me. And I wake up and I really feel that I am under the care of a higher power, of a higher protector. And I can't really define what my higher power is, what my God is. I do know that, what my meeting a couple of days ago, we were talking about the seventh step and humility and what it is. And one of the, main ingredient of humility was like, a desire to really, follow and do God's will. And I believe that now because I really believe that my higher power wants the best for me and then wants me to share, my assets with others, and having that true proportion of who I am, my weaknesses as well as my assets, and being there for others, you know. And again, like doing the fourth and fifth step, that was really hard. I had never really done a thorough one, but I thought I don't want to drink again. So I wrote down every single thing, and I did it according to the columns and my resentments, and and it was actually sort of fun writing those resentments. And one of the resentments I had were, against teachers. I was in remedial classes until the 10th grade. And later on, when my sponsor would talk to me about my resentment, she said, well, I know you're always talking about your resentments against teachers, but something changed in your life. What happened? I said, when I was in 10th grade, the substitute teacher came to our remedial class and saw my work. And she said, you shouldn't be in these classes. You should be in outside classes. And so she fought against the administration, got me out of remedial classes. And then a couple months, I was in advanced placement classes, And so my sponsor said, did you ever thank that teacher? I'm like, no, I haven't. So what I did is around Christmas time, I wrote a letter to Mrs. Berkman, and I told her how much she had changed my life. And I got a response from her, and she gave me her telephone number, and I called her. And her son answered, who was about the same age I was. And he said, oh, Irene Nunez, like, oh my God, like that was one of the best Christmas cards my mom has ever gotten, and it was just, it was wonderful. And I got to treat her for lunch when I was working, and then really tell her about my life, including Alcoholics Anonymous, why my life had changed because of her. And it was like, great, But I know when I shared my fifth step, the other thing I wrote was like a take to the grave section in my inventory, things I would never, ever tell anyone. And I thought, I'm going to write this down. I may not share it, but I'm going to write it down because I'm willing, And when we did the fifth step, she said, is there anything you want to share? I'm like, yes, I had all this stuff and I was cringing. I was like, I don't want to share it, but I did. And like afterwards, I was so free. And she said, go into the backyard and just give thanks to God that you've been able to do this. And it was a full moon that night. And I felt like howling at the moon because I was so free. I felt like, wow, there was like no barrier between God and me. And there was no barrier between, God's kids and me. It was just amazing. And, the things have been hard. I had to make amends to my dad. I remember talking to my sponsor, and she said, I want you to be a good daughter to him. I'm like, oh my God, didn't you just hear my inventory? Because my dad, was spiritually sick, and there was a lot of abuse that happened in my family of all kinds. But she, I remember sitting in the car with her, and I said, my dad doesn't deserve forgiveness, I said to her. And she said, that might be true, but if you don't get over this resentment, you're going to drink over it. And that felt true, that felt real. So I had to go visit my dad. And by then, he had a stroke, he was bedridden. And I just had to go and be a good daughter to him. I remember one time I bought him a TV, and the delivery guy came over, and my dad said to him, like, do you have any kids? And the guy said, no, I don't have any kids yet, because the guy was like in his early 20s. And my dad said, well, I hope one day you have a daughter as wonderful as Irene. And I thought my dad always hated me, When he passed away, I was like free of all these resentments. And, like for me, resentments are like that old, Scrooge, Christmas Carol, where he's visited by his old partner, and he's a ghost with all these chains. And, he talks about, I created this link by link. For me, resentments are link by link. It imprisons me more than it does the other person, And, just sobriety has been wonderful, and ups and downs, like sometimes I haven't done things perfectly. When I was about 15 years sober, I stopped going to Alcoholics Anonymous because life was getting really good on the outside. And I forgot my primary purpose, which is stay sober, help another alcoholic achieve sobriety. And I had friends and previous sponsors calling me saying, we haven't seen you at meetings. Are you okay? Oh yeah, I'm okay. I'm okay. And little by little, I was not okay. And what happened one day, I was at work and I had my big book in a desk drawer. And I thought, wow, I don't even know why I have this. I haven't been going to meetings. So I thought, I'm going to take it away. I'll put it in a box. And then later on, I felt like, oh, that feels weird. I'll put it back in the desk drawer. Later on that afternoon, one of my colleagues, actually, I had left my ID on my desk, and I called my colleague and I said, "Can you please put my ID in the desk drawer? Because with this ID, it's really important. It gets me in the jail, but most importantly, it gets me out of the jail. So I need it." And so he put it, and then later on, the next day, he went up to me and said, "I don't mean to pry, Irene, but when I put your ID, I saw a big book of Alcoholics Anonymous." And initially I was embarrassed. I'm like, because he's a top-notch attorney. And I thought, yeah, I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, even though I hadn't been going to meetings. And he said, "You know what? I can't stop drinking and drugging. Would you please take me to a meeting?" And I'm like, "Oh, yes, of course." And I hadn't been going. So I said, "I'll meet him at a meeting, the same one that I used to greet at." And you know what? He didn't show up, but I did. And I heard the message and I called a friend of mine who had been asking, what's going on. And I told her, the truth. I've been lying. I haven't been wanting to go to meetings, nor, I haven't been going, nor do I want to. And we got back into throwing myself into meetings, getting a new sponsor, someone I could be accountable for. Because I had, other sponsors who are really nice and kind, but they'll say, call me when you need to. Well, in my head, I don't really need to, that's why I need to be accountable. And so I'm just, coming, I was able to retire, and I'm just so grateful for that. I get to be free. And as I was telling, you earlier, there've been some up and downs. When I was told I had macular degeneration, that I needed to get a shot in my eye, I called my sponsor. And I was so afraid in the doctor's office. My leg and knee were just shaking so much, I could not will it to stop. And I called my sponsor and she said, "Let's just do some prayer or meditation right now." And she said, "Focus on some noise that's louder than your head." Well, it was Monday. It was trash day, which is so appropriate to throw that out there. And it was trash day, and I heard the trash trucks coming, and I was able to focus and meditated, and that leg shake went away. I was able to do what I'm supposed to do, But the thing that's helped me so much is like being able to carry that 12th step, not just to my sponsees, but to others. And I've had AA sisters who've had to go through something similar. And they called me and they, "Oh my God, I'm going through this. I don't know what, my eye stuff." And I can share that experience, strength, and hope with them, and that anything, you're not going to be alone in Alcoholics Anonymous. That's one adventure I can guarantee you. If you're new, you're not going to be alone, no matter what you go through, and it was just so, again, it was so nice to be greeting out there and with Luna, I don't know, with Kyle and his dog. My last story is during COVID, it was really hard. I was, there were some issues at work, whatever, but I was able to work sometimes at home, and we had a dog named Luna. She was so special. She was wonderful, and I was working at home, and she was outside. And she was playing, and then I let her out, and then like 5 minutes later, she wanted to come back in. I'm like, "What's going on?" And I saw that her legs were paralyzed. And what happened is she had jumped for a squirrel and broke her back. And it was just so horrible. And it was during COVID, and they would only let one person into the vet. So we called a vet that would come to the yard, our backyard. And so they came, and it was a beautiful day. It was blue skies, puffy clouds. And I saw my dog Luna, and she looked up. It was like she was having her own connection with her higher power. Like she owned, almost like a smile. It was almost like saying, "You know what? I'm ready, God. I loved and been loved. What more do I want in life? And we had, she passed away peacefully. And I thought to myself, God, that's what Alcoholics Anonymous has given me. I've been loved, but most importantly, I've been able to give love. And what more do I want, from my life than what Alcoholics Anonymous has given me, that I've been able to hopefully carry this message that someone who's a hopeless, fallen down drunk, someone who couldn't get this program can get long-time sobriety. And I'm just so grateful to be here, and thank you so much.